Brett and I started dating 3 years ago, and 2 months later, he got orders for deployment. He was a trauma surgeon with the Navy, stationed overseas most of the year, and our relationship became a routine of video calls and twice-yearly visits when he had leave. I'd gotten used to the distance, used to falling asleep with my phone propped on the pillow while we talked, used to marking calendar dates for his next stateside rotation. My friend Anna thought I was crazy. She kept pushing me to date other people, insisting long distance never worked, but I brushed her off. Brett was worth waiting for. He called every single day, sent care packages with little notes tucked inside, remembered every detail I mentioned about my life. When we did see each other, everything felt right. Last month, Brett mentioned he'd be in San Diego for 3 weeks of training before his next deployment. He said the schedule would be brutal, 14-hour days, and suggested we skip this visit to save money for a longer trip in December. But 3 weeks felt too close to pass up, and I wanted to surprise him. I bought a plane ticket without telling him and texted Anna my plans. She called immediately, asking if I was just showing up unannounced, what if he was busy. I explained it was a surprise, that I'd take him to dinner and we'd have the evening together. Anna went quiet for a moment before mentioning she'd seen something online about military romance scams. Not that she was saying Brett was lying, but still. I've met him in person, twice. She backed down, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. The flight felt endless. I kept checking my phone, resisting the urge to text Brett, wanting to keep the surprise intact. He'd mentioned he was staying on base during training, and I figured I could get visitor access, or at least have someone deliver a message to him. When we landed, I took a cab straight to the naval base. The visitor control center was smaller than I expected, just a security checkpoint with a bored-looking clerk behind plexiglass. I walked up and explained I was there to see Lieutenant Brett Rhodes, that he was doing surgical training this month. She turned to her computer and typed, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, she frowned and typed again. Then she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, we have no record of an officer by that name." My mind went blank for a second. "Are you sure?" "Brett Rhodes, trauma surgeon. He said he'd be here for 3 weeks." She checked again, shaking her head. She'd searched active duty, reserves, nothing. Could he be at a different base? I insisted he'd specifically said San Diego, pulling out my phone to show her our text conversation, explaining he'd been deployed for almost 3 years. She told me she'd get her supervisor. While I waited, another clerk walked past, an MP with sergeant stripes. I caught his attention and showed him a photo of Brett in his dress, the one he'd sent me for our anniversary. The MP studied it for maybe 5 seconds before handing my phone back. "Ma'am, that uniform is a costume. The rank insignia is upside down." The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at the photo, at Brett's proud smile, at the uniform I'd never questioned. "What do you mean, upside down?" He pointed at the screen, showing me details I'd never noticed. Wrong placement, incorrect ribbons, insignia that looked right, but wasn't. "Whoever sold him this didn't know what they were doing," he explained. "That wasn't a real Navy uniform." I left the base in a daze, my hands shaking as I got back in the cab. The driver asked where to, and I pulled up the return address from one of Brett's care packages, the one he'd said was his off-base apartment for when he had weekend leave. I gave the driver the address without thinking it through, without planning what I'd say or do. I just needed to understand. The neighborhood looked normal, residential, the kind of place where people had families and dogs and backyard barbecues. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house that matched the address. A sedan was parked in the driveway, a child's bike lying on its side near the garage. I walked up to the front door. My finger hovered over the doorbell, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing, what I'd say, what I'd find. But I'd come this far, and I needed answers. I knocked. A woman opened the door, a baby on her hip. 2 kids, maybe 4 and 6, ran past her legs, screaming something about whose turn it was for the tablet. She asked if she could help me, bouncing the baby on her hip. I explained I was looking for Brett Rhodes, stumbling over how to describe our relationship before finally introducing myself as Joyce, his girlfriend. Her eyes widened. She introduced herself as Melanie, Brett's sister, then looked behind her and back at me, insisting I'd better come in. I followed her inside. The kids kept running circles, ignoring us. Melanie shifted the baby to her other hip and gestured toward a door that presumably led to a basement, starting to say something about not knowing what he'd told me. I told her he'd claimed to be a surgeon deployed with the Navy. Melanie closed her eyes. "Jesus Christ, Brett." She opened them again, and I saw pity there. "He's not a surgeon. He's not in the Navy. He's been living in my basement for 5 years." I tried to process this. We'd been dating for 3 years, we video called every day. He wore the uniform. None of it made sense. Melanie explained he'd bought the uniform online. That video calling people was pretty much all he did. She pointed to the basement door, apologizing and admitting she'd had no idea he was doing this to someone. I walked to the door, opened it, started down the stairs, and there he was. Brett sat on a sagging couch in stained sweatpants and a gaming headset, controller in his hands, eyes locked on a massive TV screen. Energy drink cans covered every surface: the coffee table, the floor, the windowsill. Empty pizza boxes were stacked in the corner. He hadn't shaved in days, maybe weeks. The basement smelled like unwashed laundry and stale food. He didn't even look up when I reached the bottom of the stairs. Just kept mashing buttons, completely absorbed in whatever game he was playing. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, watching this stranger who looked like Brett, but couldn't possibly be the man I'd been dating. The man who called me every night and sent me thoughtful care packages and talked about our future together. I said his name. Nothing. I said it louder. He paused the game then, pulling off his headset and turned to look at me. For a second I saw panic flash across his face, but then it was gone, replaced by this weird casual smile like I'd just shown up for a normal visit. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't sure it was really me standing in his sister's basement. I asked him what the hell this was, gesturing at the room, at him, at everything. He set down the controller and stood up, and I noticed he'd gained weight, that his face looked different than it did on our video calls. He started explaining that he could clarify everything, that it wasn't what it looked like, but his eyes kept darting to the stairs like he was hoping Melanie would come save him. I told him to start talking, right now. No more lies. He ran his hand through his greasy hair and launched into this rambling explanation about how he'd lost his job 5 years ago, how the economy had been terrible and he'd sent out hundreds of applications but nothing worked out, how he'd moved in with Melanie temporarily while he got back on his feet. He said it like those were reasonable explanations for catfishing me for 3 years. I asked about the Navy, about the deployment, about the uniform. He admitted he'd never been in the military, that he'd bought the uniform from some costume website because he thought it would make him seem more interesting on the dating app where we'd initially matched, before the mutual friends party that I now realized might not have actually happened. He claimed he'd planned to tell me the truth after we'd been talking for a while. But then I seemed so impressed by the military thing, and he didn't want to disappoint me. He was acting like this was some minor misunderstanding, like he'd just exaggerated his height on his profile or something. I asked about the video calls, about how we'd talked every single day for 3 years. How did he fake deployment? Brett actually looked proud when he answered this part. He explained he'd researched time zones and military schedules, that he'd set alarms to call me at times that would make sense for someone overseas. The background in his calls was just a corner of Melanie's house that he'd set up to look official. He pointed to a spot by the washing machine where he'd apparently hung some kind of backdrop. He said all of this like it was clever problem solving, not absolutely deranged behavior. I asked about the 2 times we'd met in person, the times I'd flown to meet him when he supposedly had leave. He admitted those were the only times he'd actually left Melanie's house in years. He'd borrowed her car, driven to a hotel, pretended to be on leave. He'd used money from, and here's where it got even worse, from Melanie's disability checks that were meant for her kids. I just stared at him. This man I'd loved, who I'd waited for, who I'd turned down dates for, who I'd built my entire life around for 3 years, was an unemployed basement dweller who'd stolen from his sister's disabled children to maintain his fake military persona long enough to take me to dinner twice. I asked if anything had been real. Anything at all. Brett insisted his feelings were real, that he did care about me, that everything we'd talked about and shared had been genuine even if the circumstances around it weren't. He stepped toward me, reaching out like he was going to touch my arm, and I moved back so fast I almost tripped over an energy drink can. I told him not to come near me, that he was delusional if he thought any part of this could be considered real feelings. He got defensive then, insisting I was being dramatic, that lots of people exaggerated online, that he'd been planning to tell me everything once we got engaged and he could explain it better. Engaged. This man thought we were headed toward engagement while he was living in his sister's basement playing video games on her disability money. I asked him what exactly he did all day if he wasn't deployed. Brett actually looked embarrassed for the first time, admitting he mostly played video games and watched streams, that he'd stopped looking for work after the first year because his anxiety got too bad. He said it like that was supposed to make me feel sorry for him. Melanie appeared at the top of the stairs then, asking if everything was okay down there. Her voice was tight, and I realized she'd probably been listening to the whole thing. I climbed back up the stairs. Melanie was standing in her kitchen, the baby still on her hip, and she looked exhausted in a way that went beyond just having 3 young kids. She started apologizing, saying she'd known Brett was video chatting with someone, but she'd assumed it was just online friends, gaming buddies, that sort of thing. She'd had no idea he was pretending to be deployed, pretending to have a whole different life. I asked how long she'd been supporting him. 5 years, she confirmed. He'd moved in after losing his job at a call center, and she'd let him stay because he was family and he promised it would just be temporary. But temporary turned into months, then years, and now she was stuck with a grown man who contributed nothing while she raised 3 kids on disability payments and her husband's salary. The husband, Roger, apparently had no idea Brett was catfishing anyone either. Melanie said Roger barely tolerated Brett being there as it was, that they fought about it constantly, that Roger wanted him out but Melanie felt guilty because Brett was her brother, and where else would he go? I told her he'd stolen from her to fund our 2 in-person meetings. Melanie's face went white. She asked how much. I didn't know the exact amount, but I walked her through the timeline. The hotel stays, the dinners, the rental car he'd shown up in both times, probably a few $1,000s total. She sat down heavily in one of her kitchen chairs, shifting the baby to her lap. She said she'd noticed money missing from her account, but Brett had convinced her she'd just miscalculated, that raising 3 kids made it hard to keep track of expenses. She'd believed him because he was her brother, because she wanted to trust him. Brett came up from the basement then, and I swear to God he had the nerve to look annoyed that I was still there, like I was the problem in this situation. He told Melanie I was blowing things out of proportion, that he'd borrowed some money but he'd been planning to pay it back. Melanie asked him how exactly he'd been planning to pay anything back when he hadn't had a job in 5 years. He didn't have an answer for that. I told them both I was leaving, that I needed to get to the airport. Brett started following me to the door, saying we should talk about this more, that we could work through it, that our connection was too strong to just throw away over a misunderstanding. I turned around and told him there was no connection, that you can't have a real connection with someone who doesn't exist, that the Brett I'd been dating was a complete fiction, and the real Brett was a man living off his sister in her basement. I told him not to contact me ever again, that if he did, I'd figure out if what he did counted as fraud and go to the police. His face finally showed something other than casual defensiveness, actual fear. He backed off, hands up, insisting he understood, that he'd respect my wishes. Melanie walked me to the door, apologizing again. She handed me a piece of paper with her number on it, saying if I needed anything for insurance or proof of what happened, she'd verify everything. She looked like she was going to cry, and I realized this was probably humiliating for her too, finding out her brother had been doing this from her house. I took a cab back to the airport and managed to get on a standby flight that left that same night. The whole flight back, I kept checking my phone, half expecting Brett to message me with more excuses or apologies, but there was nothing. Radio silence from the man who'd called me every single day for 3 years. Anna picked me up from the airport at midnight. I'd texted her the basics. Navy boyfriend was fake, living in basement, never deployed. And she'd responded with about 40 messages ranging from shock to rage to, I told you something was weird about him. We went back to my apartment and I told her everything while she made tea, and periodically yelled about what an absolute psychopath Brett was. She asked what I was going to do now, if I was going to report him or tell people or what. I honestly didn't know. What do you do when you find out your boyfriend of 3 years doesn't exist? That the person you built your life around, waited for, planned a future with, was actually just some unemployed guy in San Diego who'd gotten really good at scheduling fake military calls? The worst part is, I keep thinking about all the times I defended him to Anna and my family. My mom had asked why I couldn't date someone local, someone I could actually see more than twice a year, and I'd given her this whole speech about real love transcending distance, about supporting military members and their sacrifices. My dad thanked Brett for his service the one time they video chatted. I'd turned down dates and opportunities because I was committed to waiting for someone who didn't exist. I don't even know what to call this. Catfishing doesn't seem adequate for 3 years. Fraud? Emotional manipulation? Just really, really elaborate lying? Anna says I should post about it online, that other people have probably gone through similar things and might have advice. But I honestly don't know what advice anyone could give me except maybe watch out for men in fake military uniforms buying stuff from costume websites. So, yeah, that's where I'm at. Dating a fake Navy surgeon who turned out to be real unemployed basement dweller. Living every woman's absolute nightmare of a long-distance relationship gone wrong. At least now I know why he never wanted me to surprise him at the base. Second update. Okay, so I posted 4 days ago about discovering my Navy surgeon boyfriend was actually living in his sister's basement, and the response has been insane. A bunch of you asked questions that got me thinking about things I didn't mention in my original post. And honestly, going back through everything has made this so much worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, the immediate aftermath. The day after I posted, I was sitting at my kitchen table just staring at my phone, and Anna was making breakfast even though it was like 2 in the afternoon. She'd basically moved into my apartment since I got back from San Diego, worried I was going to have some kind of breakdown. Which, fair, because I definitely felt like I was on the edge of one. My mom called. She calls every Sunday like clockwork, and usually I'd have Brett on video chat during these calls so she could say hi to him. I'd completely forgotten it was Sunday until I saw her name on my screen. Anna looked at me and asked if I was going to answer. I picked up. My mom started talking immediately, asking where Brett was, saying she wanted to congratulate him because she'd sent him a care package last week with homemade cookies and some of those wool socks he'd mentioned wanting. She'd been sending him care packages. My mom had been sending care packages to a man living in his sister's basement pretending to be deployed. I told her we needed to talk, that something had happened. She went quiet in that way moms do when they know bad news is coming, asking if Brett was hurt, if something happened overseas. I explained there was no overseas, that Brett had never been deployed, that he wasn't in the Navy at all. The words came out flat, factual, because if I put any emotion into them, I was going to start crying, and I was so done crying over this man. My mom didn't say anything for like 10 full seconds. Then she asked me to repeat what I'd just said, her voice shaking. I told her the whole story. The base visit, the fake uniform, Melanie's basement, everything. My mom kept interrupting with questions that I didn't have answers to, asking how this was possible, how he'd fooled everyone for 3 years, why someone would do this. When I finished, she started crying. Not like sad crying, but angry crying. The kind where she gets really quiet and you know she's absolutely furious. She said she needed to call my dad, that he'd want to know, and hung up. 20 minutes later, my dad called back. And here's where I learned something new that I didn't mention in my original post, because honestly, I'd blocked it out of my memory until my dad brought it up. My dad reminded me that last year, when Brett supposedly had emergency leave because of a family situation, my parents had loaned him money, $3,000. Brett had called my dad directly, explained that his mother was sick and he needed to get home quickly, but military pay schedules meant he didn't have cash available immediately. My dad, being the generous person he is, had sent the money via wire transfer that same day. Brett had promised to pay it back within a month. He never did. When I'd asked him about it a few months later, he said there'd been complications with the military banking system, some kind of hold on his account, and he'd get it sorted out soon. Then he'd sent my parents an expensive gift basket with a note apologizing for the delay, and they'd told him not to worry about it. That family helps family. I had completely forgotten about this. $3,000 that my parents never got back. Money that Brett had stolen using his fake military persona and probably spent on video games or energy drinks or whatever the hell he did in that basement. My dad wasn't yelling, which was somehow worse. He just kept saying he couldn't believe it, that he'd trusted Brett, that he'd thanked him for his service. He asked if I was going to report Brett to the police. Honestly, I hadn't even thought about police. I'd been so focused on the emotional devastation that the criminal aspect hadn't fully registered. But my dad was right. This was fraud. Brett had obtained money under false pretenses, had impersonated military personnel, had probably broken multiple laws. I told my dad I'd think about it, that I needed to process everything first. He said he understood, but that he wanted that money back, that it wasn't about the amount, it was about the principle. Then he asked if I needed anything, if I wanted him and my mom to come stay with me for a few days. I told him I was okay, that Anna was here, but I'd let them know if I needed them. After we hung up, I just sat there feeling like the worst daughter in the world. I'd brought this man into my parents' lives, had vouched for him, and he'd stolen from them. Anna tried to tell me it wasn't my fault, that I'd been lied to just like everyone else. But that didn't make me feel any better. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I unblocked Brett's number. Not because I wanted to talk to him, but because I needed to see if he'd tried to contact me. And oh boy, had he tried. 47 text messages. 47. They started out apologetic, then got desperate, then angry, then apologetic again. He'd called 16 times. Left voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to yet. The texts were a trip. The first ones were what you'd expect. He was so sorry. He never meant to hurt me. Could we please just talk about this? But then they got weird. He started sending me screenshots of articles about long-distance relationships and catfishing. Like he was trying to educate me on why what he did wasn't that bad, actually. One message said that technically he'd never lied about his feelings, only his circumstances, and wasn't emotional honesty more important than factual honesty. This man really tried to philosophy major his way out of a 3-year elaborate fraud scheme. But then I got to a message that made me see red. He'd written that he understood I was upset, but I needed to understand his perspective too. That he'd been deeply depressed, and the fake military persona had been a coping mechanism. That our relationship had been the only thing keeping him going. He said taking that away from him now could have serious consequences for his mental health. He was trying to make me feel responsible for his well-being after what he'd done. Like I was supposed to keep up the charade because otherwise he might get sad? Absolutely not. I was about to respond, something really angry and probably full of curse words, when Anna grabbed my phone out of my hands. She reminded me that engaging was exactly what he wanted, that men like Brett thrived on getting reactions, that the best thing I could do was keep him blocked and move on. She was right, but I was so angry I could barely see straight. I blocked his number again and threw my phone across the room. That's when Melanie texted. On a different number I hadn't blocked because I hadn't known she had my contact info. She apologized for reaching out, said Brett had given her my number from his phone, and asked if we could talk. I told Anna about the text, and she immediately said it was probably Brett trying to get to me through his sister, that I should ignore it. But something made me respond. Maybe because Melanie had seemed genuinely horrified when I'd showed up at her house, or because she'd offered to help if I needed proof of anything, or because I wanted answers that only someone living with Brett could provide. I texted back asking what she wanted to talk about. She said she'd kicked Brett out, that after I'd left, she'd confronted him about the stolen money, and he'd admitted to taking way more than I'd known about. Nearly $8,000 total over the past 2 years. She'd told him he had 1 week to find somewhere else to live. Roger, her husband, had apparently completely lost it when he found out. They'd been fighting about Brett living there for years, and this was the final straw. Roger had wanted to call the police immediately, but Melanie had talked him out of it because Brett was still her brother, and she didn't want him to have a criminal record. I asked where Brett was now. She said he'd been staying with their cousin Nathan for the past 3 days, but Nathan was getting tired of him too because Brett just sat around playing video games and eating Nathan's food without contributing anything. Then Melanie said something that made me realize how much worse this whole situation was. She told me she'd gone through Brett's computer after he left, not snooping but legitimately trying to figure out what he'd been doing with all that stolen money. She'd found his dating app accounts. Plural. Brett had profiles on 5 different dating apps. All of them had the same fake military photos, the same surgeon backstory, slightly different names but same basic persona. And he'd been actively messaging women on all of them. Melanie sent me screenshots. I recognized some of the photos from our early conversations, but there were others I'd never seen. Brett in the fake uniform at different angles, Brett in what looked like scrubs that he'd probably also bought online, Brett with photoshopped backgrounds that were supposed to look like military bases or hospital settings. Some of the conversations she'd screenshot were recent, like within the past month, recent, while he was supposedly committed to me and talking about our future. He was out there chatting up other women with the same lies he told me. I asked Melanie how many women he was talking to. She said from what she could tell, at least 15 actively, but his message history went back years and showed hundreds of conversations. Some fizzled out after a few messages, but others had gone on for months. One woman he'd been talking to for over a year, someone named Patricia who lived in Seattle and apparently thought she was also engaged to Navy Surgeon Brett. Anna read the screenshots over my shoulder and started Googling military romance scams. Apparently this is a whole thing. There are men who specifically target women with fake military personas because it explains away the distance, the limited contact, the inability to video chat from certain locations. The military angle makes them seem honorable and trustworthy, and it gives them built-in excuses for why they need money. But here's what made Brett different from the typical scammer. He wasn't asking me for money directly. He'd stolen from my parents and his sister, sure, but he'd never asked me to wire him cash or buy him gift cards or any of the usual scam tactics, which made me wonder what his actual endgame was. Was he just lonely? Did he get off on the attention? Was he planning to eventually ask for money once he'd secured enough trust? I texted Melanie asking if Brett had ever explained why he did this, what he got out of it. She said she'd asked him the same thing. His answer was that he'd started the fake profile as a joke after losing his job, just to see if anyone would believe it. Then one person had believed it, and talking to her had made him feel like someone other than a loser living with his sister. So he'd kept going, and then it became multiple people, and the fake life felt more real than his actual life, and he couldn't stop. He'd told Melanie that talking to me specifically had been different, that he'd actually fallen for me, that what we had was real even if the circumstances weren't. Melanie said she'd told him that was insane, that you can't have real feelings in a fake relationship. But Brett had insisted she didn't understand. I told Melanie that Brett had been sending me messages trying to guilt me about his mental health. She sighed. I could practically hear it through the text, and said that was typical Brett behavior. He'd been doing that his whole life, using depression and anxiety as excuses for why he couldn't work, couldn't contribute, couldn't do basic adult things. She said she felt terrible for enabling him for so long, that she should have kicked him out years ago instead of letting it get to this point. I asked if she was actually going to report him for the stolen money. She said she didn't know, that Roger wanted her to, but she was struggling with the idea of sending her own brother to jail. But she'd at least filed a report with her bank, and they were investigating the unauthorized transactions. Then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to talk to some of the other women Brett was scamming, to warn them about what he was doing. I immediately said no. Absolutely not. I was barely holding myself together dealing with my own situation. I didn't need to take on the emotional labor of explaining to 15 other women that their Navy surgeon boyfriend was a fraud. That felt like way too much. Like I'd be inserting myself into Brett's mess even more than I already was. But Melanie kept pushing, saying these women deserved to know, that some of them might be sending Brett money or making life decisions based on his lies. She said Patricia from Seattle had apparently quit her job to prepare for moving to San Diego to be closer to Brett's. This woman had quit her job, had upended her entire life for someone who didn't exist. I told Melanie I'd think about it, but I really didn't want to be involved. After that conversation, I spent probably 3 hours going through every single message Brett and I had ever exchanged. Anna sat with me, helping me make a timeline of his lies. And holy hell, there were so many. The emergency leave when his mother was supposedly sick. His mother had been dead for 10 years. The surgery he'd performed that saved someone's life and got him a commendation never happened. The time he said he couldn't video chat for a week because he was on a submarine. He'd just been playing a new video game release and didn't want to be bothered with maintaining the charade. Every story, every excuse, every explanation had been a lie. Even small things. He'd told me he was allergic to shellfish, but Melanie later confirmed he ate shrimp all the time. He'd said his favorite movie was some military drama I'd never heard of, but Anna found the title and it didn't exist. He'd created an entire fictional life, and I'd believed all of it. The worst part was finding the care packages I'd sent him. I'd kept copies of the tracking numbers, and when I looked them up, half of them had been delivered to Melanie's address, which I'd known. But several had been returned to sender, and I'd never known because Brett had told me he'd received them. He'd probably just looked at the tracking numbers I'd sent him and lied about opening them. I'd spent hundreds of dollars on care packages that either got stolen by someone on Melanie Street or were sitting in a postal return warehouse somewhere. Photos I'd printed and laminated so they wouldn't get damaged in shipping. Books I'd carefully selected because he'd mentioned wanting to read them. All of it for someone who didn't even bother to ensure the packages actually reached him. Anna suggested I try to get my money back from some of this stuff, maybe file claims with the postal service or something, but honestly I was too exhausted to even think about it. My phone buzzed. Another text from Melanie. She said Brett had just shown up at her house demanding his computer back, that Roger had physically blocked the door and told him he wasn't welcome there anymore. Brett had caused a whole scene in front of the neighbors, yelling about how Melanie had ruined his life by telling me the truth and kicking him out. Brett had apparently told her that I'd been stalking him, that I'd shown up uninvited and invaded his privacy, and that he was considering getting a restraining order against me. I couldn't even formulate a response to that level of delusion. I'd stalked him? I'd shown up at the address he provided, looking for the person he claimed to be, after 3 years of a relationship he initiated with lies. Melanie assured me she'd told Brett he was being ridiculous, that she'd been the one to let me in and confirm everything, and that if anyone should be worried about restraining orders, it was him since he'd committed actual fraud. But the fact that he was trying to flip this around and make himself the victim was just so perfectly on brand for everything I'd learned about him. Anna asked if I wanted to file for a restraining order first. Beat him to it. I didn't even know if I could or if his behavior qualified. He'd lied to me, sure, but was that illegal in a way that would merit a restraining order? The money he'd stolen was from my parents and Melanie, not directly from me. I told Anna I'd look into it, but right now I just wanted to be done with all of this. But then my phone rang. It was Nathan, Brett's cousin, the one who'd been letting Brett crash at his place. Nathan apologized for calling out of nowhere. Brett had given him my number and said he needed to talk to me about Brett's behavior because it was getting concerning. I asked what he meant by concerning. Nathan wanted to warn me that Brett might try to show up wherever I lived, that he'd been asking Nathan questions about where I worked and what my schedule was like. Brett didn't know where I lived. We'd never gotten to that point in our relationship since he was supposedly deployed. But he knew what city I was in, knew where I worked because I'd mentioned the company name in conversation. It wouldn't be that hard for him to figure out more if he really wanted to. I asked Nathan if he thought Brett would actually show up, if I should be worried about my safety. Nathan hesitated before saying he didn't think Brett would hurt me physically, but he definitely wasn't thinking clearly and seemed fixated on trying to convince me that our relationship could still work if I just listened to him. I thanked Nathan for the warning and hung up, told Anna what he'd said. Anna immediately went into protective mode, saying I should tell my apartment complex to not let anyone up who wasn't on my approved list, that I should vary my routes to work. And that's where I'm at now. It's been a week since I discovered the truth, and somehow this situation keeps getting worse. My parents are out $3,000. Melanie is dealing with her marriage and $8,000 stolen. Brett is apparently having some kind of breakdown and might be planning to show up at my work. And I'm sitting here wondering how the hell a simple surprise visit turned into whatever this nightmare is. Some of you commented on my original post asking if I'd tried reverse image searching his photos, or if there were any other red flags I'd missed. I did reverse search them. They're all him, not stolen from some stock photo site. He'd actually gone to the effort of getting professional photos taken in his fake uniform. So yeah, that's the update. The Navy surgeon who wasn't turned out to be even worse than I thought, and now I'm apparently on stalker alert. Living the dream over here. Okay, so this is going to be my last update because honestly I'm exhausted. And also because there's been some resolution, though not the kind I was expecting. 3 days after my last update, I was leaving work around 6 in the evening. Our office is in one of those older buildings with a parking garage that's honestly kind of creepy at night. I'd started being hyper aware of my surroundings after Nathan's warning, checking behind me constantly, varying my routine like Anna had suggested. I was halfway to my car when I heard someone call my name. Brett was standing by the garage entrance, leaning against the wall like he'd been waiting there for a while. For a second I just froze, trying to figure out if I should run back into the building or keep walking to my car. He held up his hands immediately, doing that whole non-threatening gesture thing, saying he just wanted to talk, that he wasn't going to hurt me or anything crazy like that. He said he'd been waiting for 2 hours because he needed to explain things properly, face to face without everyone else interfering. I asked him how he even knew where I worked. He admitted he'd gone through our old messages, found the company name I'd mentioned, looked up the address online, said it wasn't that hard to figure out, which honestly made me feel violated all over again. Like even our casual conversations had given him information he could use to track me down. I told him he needed to leave, that showing up at my workplace was completely inappropriate and I didn't want to talk to him. Brett started talking faster then, words tumbling over each other, saying he knew I was angry but if I'd just listened for 5 minutes I could understand why everything happened the way it did. He said what we had was real, that the circumstances might have been fake, but his feelings weren't. And didn't that count for something? I asked him if his feelings were real when he was messaging 15 other women at the same time, if they were real when he was stealing money from my parents and his sister to fund a completely fictional life, if they were real when he spent 3 years lying about literally everything. He flinched at that, and for a second I thought he might actually acknowledge what he'd done. But instead he launched into this long explanation about how the other women didn't matter. They were just conversations. I was the only one he'd actually met in person, the only one who was real to him. He said the money was borrowed, not stolen, that he'd always planned to pay everyone back once he got a job, that he'd just been going through a rough patch and needed support. A rough patch that lasted 5 years, I pointed out. That's not a rough patch, that's a lifestyle choice. He said I was being cruel by cutting him off when he was clearly struggling with his mental health. And here's where I just completely lost it. I told him he didn't get to use mental health as an excuse for fraud. I told him I'd been depressed too, after my brother died 3 years ago. Something I'd shared with Brett during one of our early conversations when he'd pretended to understand because of his fake military trauma. I'd opened up about real grief and pain, and he'd responded with manufactured empathy based on experiences he'd never had. That wasn't mental illness. That was just being a terrible person. Brett tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I told him about my parents, about how my dad had trusted him, about how they'd sent him money when his fake mother was supposedly sick. I told him my mom had been sending him care packages with homemade food, spending hours baking cookies for someone she thought was serving overseas. I told him about the nights I'd stayed up late to match his supposed schedule, about the dates I'd turned down, about the 3 years I'd invested in a relationship with someone who didn't exist. He kept trying to say it wasn't like that I was making it sound worse than it was, but I wasn't having it. Then he said something that made me realize how truly delusional he was. He told me he understood I needed time to process everything, but once I calmed down and thought about it rationally, I'd realize we could work through this. That lots of couples overcame worse problems. That if I really loved him, I'd be willing to give him another chance. I asked him what exactly I'd be giving another chance. The trauma surgeon who didn't exist? The deployed military officer who was actually playing video games in his sister's basement? Which version of Brett was I supposed to forgive? He insisted there was only one version, that the core of who he was had always been real, that the military stuff was just window dressing. He said I'd fallen in love with him, with his personality and his humor and the way he made me feel, and none of that was fake. I told him I fell in love with someone who had discipline and dedication and was serving his country, someone who had achieved something with his life, someone who called me every day because he was committed, not because he literally had nothing else to do. The Brett standing in front of me had none of those qualities, and I wouldn't have swiped right on his real profile in a million years. That hit him hard. His whole face changed, got this angry expression I'd never seen before, and he told me I was shallow and materialistic, that I only cared about status and appearances, that this proved I'd never really loved him at all. The hypocrisy was stunning. He'd literally created a fake high-status identity because he knew women wouldn't be interested in the real him, and now he was calling me shallow for not wanting to date someone who'd been lying for 3 years. I told him we were done with this conversation, that I was getting in my car and leaving, and if he ever showed up at my work again, I'd call the police. He grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to stop me from walking away. And that's when building security showed up. Apparently someone had seen us arguing on the camera feed and called them down. Security asked if everything was okay, clearly ready to intervene if needed. I told them this man was harassing me and I wanted him removed from the property. Brett immediately let go of my arm and backed up, hands raised again, telling security this was a misunderstanding, that we were just having a relationship discussion. Security wasn't buying it. They asked me directly if I knew him and wanted him there. I said no to both questions. They escorted Brett out while he kept trying to explain, kept insisting we just needed to talk. I heard him yelling my name from across the parking garage as they walked him to the street. I sat in my car for probably 20 minutes just shaking. Then I called Anna, told her what happened. She wanted to come get me, but I told her I was fine to drive. I just needed to hear a friendly voice. When I got home, my parents were already there. Anna had called them in a panic after I'd told her what happened. My dad wanted to file a police report immediately, but my mom had a different idea. She thought Brett needed one final confrontation to actually accept reality, something he couldn't reinterpret or ignore, with witnesses present so he'd have no choice but to face what he'd done. My dad hated this plan initially, but after talking it through, we decided to try it. We'd arrange a meeting at a restaurant. My parents, Anna, and my dad's lawyer friend Douglas would be there. I'd tell Brett directly that it was over and discuss the money, and we contacted Melanie to see if she and Roger wanted to participate somehow since they were all the way in San Diego. Melanie said there was no way they could fly out. They had 3 kids, including a baby, and Brett had stolen so much money they were barely making rent. But she wanted to be part of it, so we arranged for her and Roger to join on WhatsApp video call during the meeting. Anna contacted Brett from my phone saying I'd meet him to talk. He responded within seconds, still hopeful and delusional. When Saturday came, Brett was already sitting in a booth at the diner looking nervous but optimistic. His face changed completely when he saw it wasn't just me. Anna walked in behind me, then my parents, then Douglas. Brett asked what this was, why I'd brought an audience, accused me of setting him up. I sat down across from him and told him this wasn't a reconciliation meeting. This was closure. Everyone else positioned themselves around us. My parents in the booth behind Brett, Anna at a nearby table with her phone propped up, Douglas standing close enough to intervene if needed. Then Anna turned her phone screen toward Brett. Melanie and Roger were on WhatsApp video call, and I watched Brett's face go even paler when he saw his sister staring at him through the screen. My dad introduced Douglas as his lawyer, who explained he was there to witness this conversation and advise on potential criminal charges if necessary. I told Brett everything I should have said in the parking garage, that what he did was fraud, that the Brett I'd fallen in love with didn't exist and never had, that I'd shaped my entire life around someone fictional. When I finished, Brett tried to minimize it, saying I was exaggerating, that he'd just been trying to cope with difficulty. My dad stood up then, and just the sight of him standing there made Brett shut up. Through the phone, Melanie's voice came clearly. She asked Brett point blank if he understood what he did was actually morally wrong and harmful, not just a mistake. Brett looked at the phone screen, then back at me, clearly thrown by having to face his sister this way. He hesitated before saying yes, but that he'd been in a dark place. Roger's face appeared next to Melanie's on the screen. He told Brett that desperation doesn't excuse theft, that he'd taken $8,000 from a family with 3 small children, money meant for medical expenses and childcare. His voice was harsh, angry. Douglas explained that Brett had committed wire fraud, identity theft, and larceny, that the military impersonation alone carried federal penalties, that if my parents or Melanie wanted to press charges, there was more than enough evidence for prosecution. I watched Brett's face go from defensive to genuinely scared. He kept glancing at Anna's phone where his sister and brother-in-law were watching him. I told him what we wanted. Full repayment of all money owed. $3,000 to my parents, $8,000 to Melanie and Roger. No further contact with me whatsoever. An acknowledgement that the relationship was based on lies and was definitively over. Brett agreed to repayment and no contact, though he said it would take time since he had no income. But when it came to acknowledging the relationship was over, he hesitated. He said he still believed what we had was real, that I'd eventually understand that and change my mind. So I asked him basic questions about me, my middle name, where I grew up, what I'd studied in college, my brother's name. He couldn't answer any of them accurately because he'd never actually paid attention to who I was, only to how I made him feel about himself. I told him that wasn't love, that was narcissism, that he'd been in love with the version of himself that existed when someone believed his lies, not with me as a person. He said I was being cruel, that I was purposely trying to hurt him when he was already at his lowest point. My mom leaned forward and said Brett had no idea what cruelty actually looked like, that I'd been remarkably restrained given what he'd put me through. Through the phone, Melanie said she'd spent 5 years protecting him from consequences, and all it had done was make him worse. She said she loved him because he was her brother, but she didn't like him very much right now. He had 1 month to figure out a payment plan for the money, and if he couldn't manage that, they'd file formal charges. Roger added that Nathan had asked them to tell Brett he needed to find somewhere else to stay by the end of the week. Brett stared at the phone screen and asked where he was supposed to go. Roger said that was Brett's problem to solve, not theirs. Douglas gave Brett his number and said all future communication about repayment should go through him. Brett was not to contact me or my parents directly. If the money wasn't paid or a reasonable payment plan wasn't established within 3 months, they'd pursue legal action. I stood up to leave. Brett reached across the table like he was going to grab my hand, but stopped himself when Douglas moved closer. He said my name one more time, desperate. I told him goodbye. Not see you later, not we'll figure this out, just goodbye. Then I walked out of the diner with everyone following behind me. That was 5 days ago. Brett hasn't tried to contact me since. Douglas said Brett had reached out about the repayment plan and was apparently trying to get hired at a fast food place near where he's staying. Melanie texted me that he'd moved to some extended stay motel in San Diego and was paying weekly with money Nathan had loaned him. My parents are cautiously optimistic they'll see their money back eventually, even if it takes years. So, yeah. The fake Navy surgeon is officially in my past where he belongs, and I'm never dating anyone in the military again, just to be safe.